Robert Smalls was born April 5th, 1839 to Lydia Polite at 511 Prince Street in Beaufort, South Carolina. The house, his mother, and Robert himself were all the legal property of John McKee, a wealthy white man who was most likely the man who assaulted Miss Polite and fathered Robert. Because of this, Robert was favored and set to be a house worker, but his mother didn't want him growing up to be no house Negro and arranged for him to be sent into the field so that he understood the true nature of what him and his people had been going through for hundreds of years. This led to Robert becoming increasingly rebellious and even going to jail a few times. So fearing for his safety, his mother once again made arrangements for him to be rented out to Charleston. He worked many different jobs, but he ended up falling in love with ships, and he knew the Charleston harbor and all of the sea islands better than anyone. Even with his great work on the sea, his human trafficker took all of his wages for years, and $1 out of each of his checks was given to Robert for himself. He was such a good worker and was favored so much that when he met his first wife, Hannah, them and their children were allowed to live separately from their traffickers, but were still enslaved, and the overwhelming majority of money they earned was still going to people who did no work at all. Mr. Smalls knew this wasn't the way to live, and it wasn't secure. Because they were technically owned by two different people, their marriage would never be legally recognized, and they could be taken away from each other in the blink of an eye forever. He was a stand-up guy, so the first thing he did was try and purchase his wife and kids outright, but their trafficker wanted a steep price of $800, over $28,000 in today's money. And mind you, most of his money was being sent to the McKee family. It would take decades for him to save enough money to buy them. The war started in Charleston, South Carolina at Fort Sumter. Charleston was the home of Robert and his family, and ironically, Charleston was also the largest slave port in the country. 70% of our ancestors who were kidnapped and shipped to America came in through Charleston. Robert had been working in the Charleston harbor for years. It was eventually commissioned to steer a Confederate ship, the CSS Planner. He worked this job for nearly a year, and none of the Confederates ever questioned his loyalty, but he was planning an escape the whole time. He let all the other enslaved workers on the ship know about his plan, except for one he didn't trust. On May 12, 1862, the planner picked up 4 guns and 200 pounds of ammunition. Eventually, they docked for the night, and the white crew left Smalls and the rest of the Africans to stay on the planner, just like any other night. But Smalls took this as an opportunity to take off with the ship. He didn't tell most of them that they was leaving that night, and some of them were scared to go, but eventually the feelings of excitement and longing for freedom were stronger. His wife noted that he had talked about escaping, but she never thought he was serious and would actually do it. Robert was prepared to either die or become free. Even though they had a bit of weapons, they couldn't defeat the Confederate army all on their own, and if they would have gotten captured, they would have definitely been killed anyways. But Robert was able to put on the captain's hat and imitate all of the signals at multiple Confederate forts and pass by all of them. He even stopped on the way to pick up a couple more people who were enslaved, and he successfully sailed them all to freedom. He ended up becoming a hero in the North, and he was even awarded $1,500 in prize money, almost $40,000 today, for turning in the ship to the Union, even though it was still less than his fair share. At this point, he could have easily bought a nice house and supported his family by going around the North and telling his story, but he decided to go and make a real difference. He convinced Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to allow black men to fight in the war for our freedom, and he even recruited 5,000 black men himself, who ended up creating the 1st and 2nd South Carolina Colored Regiments. He worked for the Union Army as the captain of the planner, and he made $150 a month, making him one of the highest ranking and the highest paid black men in the Union Navy. But he still never got too big-headed, and he was always keeping his people in his heart. He participated in over 15 war conflicts, and toward the end of the war, he would use the planner to deliver food and supplies to black folks in the islands, who had lost their homes and livelihoods due to the war. And after the war, the planner was put to use for the Freedmen's Bureau. After the war, he returned back home to Beaufort and bought the same property where he was born enslaved. The same place where his mother was raped and beaten and forced to work for free, he now owned and was able to make all his own decisions for the land. He was sued by John McKee, bitter and distasteful after losing the war in his home, but he ended up winning, and he kept the land and was able to live happily ever after. But Mr. Smalls was a real stand-up guy and really for the liberation of black people, so he kept on fighting. He opened stores for African people in Beaufort, spent 9 months learning how to read and write, and even opened an 18-mile railway all the way from Charleston, inland. In 1868, he was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives as a loyal Republican, back when Republicans was the ones who claimed to love black folks. He did great work in the Carolina government, but by 1874, he was already on the bigger things and was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He was fiercely against the removal of troops from the South because he knew what would happen, and eventually it did. Once the troops left and the white supremacists took back over the South, He was kicked out of office but eventually won again about 10 years later. He lived the rest of his life at 511 Prince Street. That used to be Massa's house, and he transitioned on February 23rd, 1915. His house is designated as a National Historical Landmark, and he has a statue in the U.S. National Museum of African American History and Culture. Yet too many of our schools don't teach anything about him at all, and I believe in order to rebuild our community, we have to rebuild education. When you know these strong stories of the people you come from, it helps you to understand who you truly are and guides you into the future. If you want to help me rebuild education, make sure you leave a like and subscribe. This video suggestion was given by Jared RG, and if you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments. Peace, love, and light, everybody.